We mentioned last time that in the Roaring Twenties, it was like a really wonderful time for a lot of people. Most Americans worked, could find jobs. There was economic prosperity. People were saving their money, buying the things that they wanted, like the car or automobile. But in 1929, the stock market crashed, and that negatively impacted millions upon millions of Americans. We can really say that the Great Depression is probably one of the lowest points in American history. We might call it a nadir, Nadir. So just to let everyone know how bad it was, right? We had at least half of American mortgages defaulting. So a lot of people lost their homes. Many people lost their businesses, and again, millions, at least 4 million by 1932, were unemployed, and that number jumped to 16 million by 19 um, by the time Roosevelt was in office, actually. So we want to kind of talk about that. So one thing to mention, there are some major differences in Herbert Hoover, the president who who was in office when the stock market crashed. It was not his fault. However, because he did not do a lot to address the issue, he really believed that government should be limited. He thought that volunteerism would be the way to help people, so allowing churches, organizations, other people to help those in need. However, to be honest, that just wasn't enough. Again, with that high rate of unemployment, again, of the job market being hurt, but also the housing, right, for people. Simple things like being able to buy food. Um, Most people just were not able to do that and do that adequately. So Herbert Hoover, was president. He was a very intelligent man, graduated from Stanford, came from California. He was a Republican, and we do know that he had a very strong work ethic. He had his own business. He had a mining business that was very successful before he became president. But after he became president, again, he believed in more of a hands-off approach to government, really helping people. So even though he made some small measures to address the Great Depression and the poverty, it just was not enough. And people's perception of him was, to put it mildly, horrible. They would call their shacks Hoovers, right? Or if it was a whole area of shacks, that would be a Hooverville. So they even began to equate his name with poverty. So needless to say, he was not very popular at all. Other things about Hoover that I'm sure really hurt his presidential campaign, 1932, but just hurt him in general. The interaction that he really facilitated between the bonus army and the actual army or troops. So the bonus army, they were men and their families, men who were veterans of World War One. They had been promised a bonus in 1945, but they were very scared and they were nervous. So in 1932, they marched on Washington and demand their bonuses right away. So not only did they demand it, but excuse me, they protested. The police first answered the protest or responded to the protest. That did not turn out well, very ugly. But then the president called in troops, all right, troops to squash this protest. But these protesters were veterans of the armed forces themselves who had fought for our country in World War One. So that, to me, that's just so disrespectful. There had to have been a better way to handle that. So he called in General MacArthur, right, to put down this protest. But again, if only Hoover had had the presence of mind to, at least for this time, right, change his views, allow government to help, this may not have happened. Those bonus marchers or those veterans would have probably not even had to march, or they probably wouldn't have felt like they had to march to get money to provide for their families. So that could have been done differently, but since it wasn't, and since he was already very unpopular with most Americans, seen as being someone who did not care, we know that's not the case, but perception is everything. In 1932, his campaign failed. It ultimately failed, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president. Now, a little bit about Roosevelt. He was a cousin of Teddy Roosevelt. He was born in New York. He was born very wealthy. He went to Harvard University, where he met and married Eleanor. He, in 1910, won a Senate seat in New York, but then he also went on to run in a vice presidential, as a vice president, years before he became president himself. One thing that's interesting, he contracted polio in 1921, as an adult, which is very different. So you may not notice, but he did not walk really very well. So he was really wheelchair bound a lot of the time. And usually when he was photographed sitting, maybe standing, but not really walking. And that's the reason why. So with him, Roosevelt was different. He felt that government should step in, and that government should help people, especially in a situation like the Great Depression. There is no way, in his opinion, we should allow millions and millions of Americans to go hungry and to go jobless. It just is not right. So he did, in his first 100 days, put forth the New Deal, which encompassed several programs that would help put people back to work, but also he addressed the situation with the banks. Remember how people, during the crash, they were just pulling all their money out of the bank, and oftentimes you would go to get that money out of the bank and there was no money. So he made sure, first of all, he closed down all the banks. All the banks in the United States were closed. Then he ordered the Treasury to put $2 billion in banks, right, disperse that money so that when they would reopen, they would actually have funds for people, and people could start to trust the banks again. So things like the FDIC, which we see now, that little sticker in your bank, that means it's federally insured, that something happens, your money's insured up to a certain percentage. This is not a protection that Americans had before Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. So we can thank Mr. Roosevelt for that. But those types of things, right, helping people to at least have hope, it really seemed as if Franklin Roosevelt was able to do that. He did his fireside chats. He would go on the radio and talk to the people about his plans, and again, provided them at least some measure of hope. So that is not to say that his programs solved all of the problems during the Depression, because they didn't. And he was cognizant of that, right? He was aware that, this is still not enough. I'm going to have to even put forth more programs, which he did in the second New Deal. Our video will go over that more to help Americans out. Things like the WPA, right? The CCC, we can talk about the Tennessee Valley Authority, which of course help with technology, but also help people get back to work. So all of these programs, Social Security, right? Senior citizens had no way at all of really being taken care of, right? Disabled people, so Social Security was major. These are programs that, again, help people be able to live and not just get by, so to speak, but live and actually be okay. So these are, again, protections that were not here in this country for Americans before Franklin Roosevelt and before the first New Deal and second New Deal. So we have to keep that in mind. So out of this time period, right, the Great Depression, again, we mentioned people losing homes, people losing all of their savings, people losing their businesses. We had some men, especially some men, who would just travel across the country, called hobos. They didn't have in their minds maybe a real home, or they felt so bad about how they had lost everything, they just couldn't bear to go back to what they had or didn't have. So you had men who would just ride the rails. They'd jump on a train car and ride to this town, then to the next town, then to the next town. Uh, Roosevelt, right, helped to get a lot of these men back to work. Another thing I just thought was interesting, there was one woman who talked about her childhood during the Great Depression and how her father lost everything and he was looking for work, but she had managed to save $2, a couple dollars in her piggy bank. And she would shake the piggy bank to make sure it was there. She would be so proud of it. One day she went to shake the piggy bank, but there was no money in it. And her mother looked at her and she said, "I'm so sorry, sweetie, but we had to use that. Your dad needed that to be able to get into town to look for work." And it really hurt her. She was really sad, but her father promised to pay back those $2. And she said, "But you know what? I never got paid back. He never had those $2 for me." And that, in a way, it was sad. But I thought about the United States in general. It's almost like her experience, right? At one time, excuse me, having the money that you want, saving it, and then you go to the bank, right, to shake it or to see it and to marvel at it. But then one day you go and there is no money. And it's kind of like her experience, but also her family's experience could really sum up the Great Depression for a lot of people. Another gentleman mentioned how there was just no work, there was no food. And then yet another lady mentioned how she just would see the sadness in people's eyes, right? A very sad and very scary time for a lot of people because they had never, ever experienced any time this dark or this desperate. And with that being said, the Great Depression didn't only impact Americans. The Great Depression spread outside of America, which is something that's really important to note, which we'll get into in just a second. But there were some ways that people tried to escape from the times, right? They tried to at least have some type of happiness. So you could take, this time during the 1930s, you could take 15 cents and go to a picture show, right? You could probably stay there for about 6 hours. And what they would show is maybe people dancing. They would show a movie. You would then get maybe a snippet from something the president had said, right? But for 6 hours at least, for 15 cents, this is one way you could escape. One way you could have at least some measure of joy and forget about what was happening around you. But another way, though, again, the radio shows. We think of radio shows as just being music, but at this time, radio shows encompassed everything. You could have a romance, a mystery, it could be a horror, right, show, but they were all from the radio. And it was really unique because, again, there's no visual. So the people doing the radio programs had to come up with very unique ways to make sounds so that the shows and the stories would be believable. Like, let's say, thunder, right? They would have to recreate those sounds so that you would believe you're actually there. And they did that. So that was another great way to escape through entertainment. One other thing, though, to mention during the Great Depression, again, something out of a lot of people's control at this point in the 30s, was the Dust Bowl. So the Dust Bowl, that was a time during the Great Depression where farmers in the South and Midwest, and in particular, were impacted by soil erosion, right? The lands had been farmed so much or over-farmed that the soil was just like dust. It was loose dust, and it just blew away, right? So you would have these big dust storms and dust clouds that would form, and just dust blowing just throughout that region. So bad that, you know what, you would have dust in your house. You would have dust in your car, dust in your cabinets. And if you weren't careful, if you were caught in a dust storm, you would choke. So people oftentimes would tell you, if you go to town in your car, just make sure you have things with you because you may have to stay in town. You might get caught in one of those dust storms, and you won't be able to get back home. You won't be able to even see the road. So just prepare for the worst. So that dust, though, could be seen for miles and miles and miles.